Imagine ruling the richest empire on earth and still hiding from your own accountant. That actually happened, and it's only the beginning. Here are 44 kings, sultans, and emperors who prove that no treasury, no matter how massive, can survive royal stupidity. Wars fought on vibes, palaces nobody asked for, coins made of mostly copper, and one man who tried to combine being pope with being emperor. Things get strange fast. 1. Banquets where the bread was sprinkled with actual gold flakes, because regular bread apparently lacked sparkle, was just a casual Tuesday for Caligula. The man drained the colossal surplus treasury his predecessor Tiberius had spent decades carefully building, in roughly 4 years flat. He built a floating bridge of ships across the Bay of Baiae purely to ride a horse across it and prove a soothsayer wrong. He declared war on the sea itself, ordering soldiers to stab the waves and collect seashells as battlefield trophies. He even allegedly tried to make his beloved horse Incitatus a consul. By 41 AD, Rome's coffers were empty and the Praetorian Guard had run completely out of patience. 2. Versailles started as a humble hunting lodge and ended as the most expensive vanity project in European history. Louis XIV poured so much gold into the place that entire forests were chopped down for floorboards, and rivers were physically rerouted just to feed his fountains. He stuffed it with 700 rooms, gilded everything that didn't move, and threw parties so enormous guests reportedly got lost inside the building for hours. Pile 4 ruinous wars on top of that, and France's debt by 1715 equaled roughly 20 years of royal income. His ministers begged him to slow down. Louis essentially declared he was the state, so the bills could chase themselves. They did, for a century. 3. After the Great Fire of 64 AD swept through Rome, Nero seized the smoldering aftermath as the perfect excuse to build the Domus Aurea, a palace complex so absurdly enormous it covered a third of central Rome, complete with a 120-foot golden statue of himself and a rotating dining room ceiling that showered guests with flower petals. To fund the madness, he debased the Roman denarius for the first time in imperial history, slipping cheaper metals into coins. Inflation followed faithfully. Whether or not he personally lit the match, he certainly cashed in on the ashes. By 68 AD, he was declared a public enemy, and Rome's finances staggered for decades. 4. A treasury so fat it could barely shut became Henry VIII's personal bonfire. Inherited rich and stingy from his thrifty father, Henry torched it with cartoonish glee on pointless French wars, ridiculous palaces, and parties featuring tents woven from actual gold thread. Once the cash ran low, he secretly mixed copper into the silver coinage in a scheme so transparent people could literally see the copper poking through the king's nose on the new coins. Inflation went berserk. He grabbed monastery wealth too, which bought him roughly 15 extra minutes of solvency. By 1547, the currency was a continental joke and the treasury an echo chamber. 5. Leather and brass tokens replaced silver and gold coins overnight across 14th century India because Muhammad bin Tughlaq of Delhi genuinely believed everyone would just trust him on the swap. Spoiler: every household in his sultanate promptly fired up their own little forge and minted unlimited counterfeit coins at home. The treasury collapsed almost instantly. He also forced the entire population of Delhi to march 700 miles south to a brand new capital called Daulatabad, then changed his mind 2 years later and marched them all back. Famines, revolts, and total fiscal ruin followed faithfully. Few kings managed to wreck a currency, a capital, and a kingdom quite so efficiently in one single reign. 6. Fairy tale castles look enchanting until you read the invoice attached to the back. Ludwig II of Bavaria, completely besotted with Wagner operas and medieval romance, buried himself in private debts so massive they spiraled into a full-blown crisis for the entire kingdom. He kept building Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and Herrenchiemsee, complete with golden swans, artificial grottos lit by colored glass, and a magical dining table that rose through the floor so Ludwig wouldn't have to make awkward eye contact with the servants. By 1885, his personal debt had hit 14 million marks and was climbing fast. His own ministers, panicking, formally declared him insane and removed him from power. 7. Saying yes to literally every request without ever bothering to read it became the entire governing philosophy of Vladislaus II of Hungary and Bohemia. They actually nicknamed him King Dobze, meaning King OK. Nobles asked for tax exemptions. Okay. Foreign merchants wanted trade privileges. Okay. Mercenaries demanded back wages he definitely did not have. Also somehow okay. By the early 1500s, the Hungarian treasury had been so thoroughly looted by his own administrators that the royal household couldn't afford fresh meat, and ambassadors openly pitied him. His son Louis II inherited the wreckage and died at the catastrophic Battle of Mohacs in 1526. Politeness weaponized. 8. Sebastian I of Portugal genuinely believed he was destined for Crusader glory, and apparently ending an entire dynasty was just part of the destiny. In 1578, the young king assembled the largest Portuguese army in his nation's history and marched it straight into the Moroccan desert with confidence as his only real strategy. At Alcácer Quibir, his forces were utterly routed. To ransom the captured nobles, Portugal had to scrape every last coin from the royal treasury. 2 years later, with no king and no money, the entire country was absorbed by Spain. One reckless afternoon in the desert ended Portuguese independence for 60 long years. 9. Imperial crown jewels spent more time at the pawn shop than at court under Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, around 1500. The man was so chronically broke, he invented brand new financial scams just to keep the imperial lights flickering on. He sold imperial titles like party favors, pawned regalia on rotation, and borrowed so deeply from the Fugger banking family that they basically owned him by Tuesday afternoon. At one point, he plotted to get himself elected pope while still emperor, hoping to combine the two incomes, an idea so unhinged the cardinals nearly fell out of their robes laughing. He left his grandson Charles a financial spaghetti dish. 10. Selling off your own navy to save money sounds absurd until you realize Andronikos II, Palaiologos of the Byzantine Empire, actually did it. The savings looked nice on paper for roughly 15 minutes. Without a navy, Byzantine trade collapsed. Italian merchants seized control of Mediterranean commerce, and the empire became militarily helpless in its own waters. He then hired Catalan mercenaries to fight the Turks, but couldn't pay them either. The mercenaries promptly turned around and pillaged Byzantine territory themselves. By his abdication in 1328, the empire was a shrinking ruin, a masterclass in solving a budget crisis by accidentally dissolving your own civilization. 11. Centuries of inbreeding and overspending finally cashed in their winnings under Charles II of Spain, last of the Spanish Habsburgs. Sickly from birth and barely able to govern, he watched the empire crumble around him without ever quite understanding the bills. The treasury was so empty that imperial bureaucrats reportedly went unpaid for years. Foreign ambassadors mocked Spain openly, and the once mighty navy rotted in port for lack of funds. Provinces broke away or were carved up by foreign powers like dinner. When Charles died childless in 1700, his confused will triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a continental catastrophe that bankrupted half of Europe. 12. Two of medieval Europe's largest banking houses collapsed because one English king simply couldn't keep up with his war debts. Edward III borrowed staggering sums from the Bardi and Peruzzi families of Florence to fund his 100 Years' War campaigns against France, and when his unpaid debts piled high enough, both banks imploded in the 1340s. Florence's economy nearly went down with them. Meanwhile, Edward melted royal jewels, pawned crowns, and kept right on fighting cheerfully. The man defaulted on his bankers so aggressively that the bankers themselves ceased to exist. Truly the medieval equivalent of canceling a subscription with extreme enthusiasm. 13. 4 separate bankruptcies, each one bigger than the last, all delivered by the same king ruling the richest empire on earth. Philip II of Spain pulled it off with bizarre consistency. Galleons docked weekly bursting with South American silver, and somehow Philip still couldn't pay his own soldiers. He burned through it all on wars in the Netherlands, France, the Mediterranean, plus one disastrous armada that England turned into expensive driftwood. His Genoese bankers eventually pretended not to recognize his messengers in public. The Spanish bankruptcy of 1557 shook half the banking houses of Europe. Imagine being the wealthiest man alive while hiding from your own accountant. 14. Cairo got the Parisian makeover absolutely nobody had asked for, and Egypt paid dearly for the privilege. Ismail Pasha, obsessed with European glamour, tore through the old city building grand boulevards, opera houses, and even commissioned Verdi himself to write Aida for the opening night. He bankrolled the Suez Canal, then sold his shares to the British for embarrassingly little, because he was that desperate for coins. By 1876, Egypt's debt had hit £100 million, and European bankers essentially walked in and took over running the country's finances. 3 years later, he was deposed, leaving Egypt a financial puppet draped tastefully in opera curtains. 15. Bending horseshoes with bare hands was apparently easier than balancing a budget for Augustus II the Strong. Ruler of both Poland and Saxony, he dragged Poland into the disastrous Great Northern War against Sweden, lost humiliatingly to a teenage Charles XII, and watched Polish lands get trampled for 2 long decades. Meanwhile, in Saxony, he financed an art collection so vast it filled multiple palaces, built Europe's first major porcelain factory, and threw parties so opulent they became continental punchlines. By his death in 1733, Poland was so weakened that within a generation it would be carved up and quietly erased from the map of Europe entirely. 16. France's treasury was already wobbling when Louis XVI decided he absolutely had to bankroll someone else's revolution purely to humiliate the British. He achieved that goal beautifully, then noticed his own finances now resembled a haunted mansion. By 1788, France was spending half its entire budget just on interest payments. Crops failed, bread prices doubled, and Louis genuinely could not understand why everyone seemed so annoyed all the time. He summoned the Estates General, hoping for a polite little chat about taxes, and accidentally summoned the French Revolution instead. The kingdom soon printed paper money so worthless that people reportedly used the bills as wallpaper. 17. Few things horrified medieval English barons more than watching Edward II hand entire counties' worth of jewels to his favorite courtier. Piers Gaveston received gifts so absurdly lavish that the rest of the nobility nearly staged a group intervention. Edward, completely undeterred, simply replaced him with another favorite, Hugh Despenser, and resumed the spree like nothing had happened. Disastrous Scottish campaigns, especially the catastrophe at Bannockburn in 1314, devoured whatever was left in the treasury. By 1326, even his own Queen Isabella was leading an invasion against him. He was deposed in 1327, leaving England's finances resembling the aftermath of an enthusiastic shopping hurricane. 18. The Fugger banking family practically owned a piece of Charles V's soul, and frankly, they earned it. To bribe his way into being elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, he borrowed 850,000 florins, a sum that today would casually purchase several small countries. Then he spent 4 full decades waging war against France, the Ottomans, and assorted Protestant princes simultaneously because handling one war at a time was apparently for amateurs. By the time he retired to a quiet monastery, the debt mountain he handed his son Philip was so colossal that Spanish bankruptcy basically became a treasured family tradition passed lovingly down the generations. 19. Few kings made themselves as universally hated as King John of England, and his treasury accurately reflected the achievement. After fumbling Normandy to the French in 1204, he spent the rest of his reign inventing creative new ways to extract money from his exhausted barons. Scutage, tallages, inheritance fees, fines for breathing too loudly near royal forests, you name it. He tried invading France in 1214 to win it all back, lost spectacularly, and the barons finally snapped. They forced him to sign Magna Carta, then plunged into civil war when he predictably ignored every single clause. He left a treasury full of cobwebs and a kingdom in absolute pieces. 20. Reconquering the lost western half of the Roman Empire sounded like a glorious idea, right up until Justinian I nearly bankrupted the eastern half doing it. His brilliant general Belisarius marched through Africa, Italy, and Spain, reclaiming territory. all while the imperial treasury back in Constantinople wheezed under the strain. Justinian then built the Hagia Sophia, an architectural miracle that swallowed an estimated 320,000 pounds of gold. Then plague struck in 541, halving the population and tax base overnight. By his death in 565, the empire had reclaimed glory on paper while quietly running on fumes. His successors inherited reconquered provinces they couldn't actually afford to defend. 21. Henry III somehow managed to buy a kingdom that wasn't actually for sale, didn't lie within his reach, and didn't even include directions. The Pope offered him the crown of Sicily for his young son Edmund at the bargain price of 135,000 marks, roughly twice England's entire annual royal income. There was no plan, no army in Italy, and no money. When the Pope threatened excommunication for non-payment, the barons exploded with rage and launched the Second Barons' War in 1264. England spent decades recovering. Henry never set foot in Sicily, never ruled it, and basically paid full retail price for an enormous and entirely imaginary travel brochure. 22. Forgotten medieval finds from centuries past became Charles I's favorite bedtime reading. Refusing to summon Parliament for proper taxes, he revived ancient laws nobody remembered, sold monopolies on absolutely everything including soap, and fined random nobles for the crime of owning too much land. When he finally needed serious money for actual wars, Parliament basically told him to go reflect on his choices in a quiet room. The English Civil War followed, the economy shattered, and the new republic had to invent entirely fresh tax systems from scratch just to keep the country functioning. A masterclass in turning royal stubbornness into a kingdom-sized fiscal cautionary tale. 23. Treating coronation ceremonies as competitive sports somehow worked out badly for Frederick I of Prussia, also nicknamed the Ostentatious. His 1701 self-coronation in Königsberg cost a staggering 6 million thalers, an obscene sum that Prussia, then a relatively modest territory, could absolutely not afford. He built lavish palaces in Berlin and Charlottenburg, threw exotic ceremonies that consumed years of revenue, sold court titles to anyone with a wallet, and showered his favorite courtiers with diamonds. His son, Frederick William I, inherited the bill and was so horrified he spent his entire reign furiously cutting expenses, firing court servants, and turning the throne into what amounted to a strict military accounting office. 24. A single jewel-encrusted coat worth 30,000 marks tells you everything you need to know about Richard II's relationship with money. He maintained a court of roughly 10,000 hangers-on, all eating, drinking, and parading around in velvet on the royal dime. To finance this floating circus, he invented a poll tax in 1381, so universally hated it triggered the Peasants' Revolt, with rebels storming London and chasing royal officials through the streets. Richard kept right on spending because divine right apparently included unlimited credit. In 1399, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke deposed him, and the treasury looked like it had been ransacked by a small army of velvet-loving squirrels. 25. Believing that ghostly spirits were giving you political advice is generally a red flag, but Frederick William II of Prussia found it strangely persuasive. A secret society called the Rosicrucians swindled him into expensive mystical rituals for years. Meanwhile, he inherited Frederick the Great's famously full treasury and drained it with breathtaking speed, emptying within roughly a decade what had taken 40 careful years to accumulate. He spent enormously on his various mistresses, on lavish new palace decorations, and on disastrous interventions in revolutionary France that achieved absolutely nothing strategically. By 1797, Prussia's finances were a shadow of what he had inherited. His uncle Frederick must have been spinning in his grave. 26. The War of the Triple Alliance against Paraguay turned out to be the financial cliff Pedro II of Brazil never quite walked his empire back from. He insisted on prosecuting the war until total Paraguayan defeat, a noble decision that ran the bill past $600 million in 1860s money and saddled Brazil with crushing debt for decades. The treasury simply never recovered. Slavery was abolished in 1888 without compensation to plantation owners, who promptly funded the coup that toppled him in 1889. A genuinely cultured and well-meaning monarch, Pedro accepted exile politely, packed his beloved books and astronomy notes, and departed for Europe, leaving the young Brazilian Republic to inherit the financial wreckage. 27. Sigismund III Vasa chased the Swedish crown across 40 stubborn years like a man chasing a hat in a hurricane. He poured Polish gold into wars against Sweden, then Russia, then the Ottomans, then anyone who happened to glance at him sideways. He briefly grabbed Moscow in 1610, then immediately couldn't afford to hold it, which is the medieval equivalent of conquering a city by accident and then leaving the front door keys in the lock. Polish nobles, sick of funding vanity wars, refused taxes. The army mutinied repeatedly. By 1632, he had achieved no Swedish throne, no Russian throne, only a hollow treasury and the very seeds of Poland's future erasure. 28. Christian IV of Denmark genuinely fancied himself Europe's great Protestant champion, which was fantastic for the ego and devastating for Denmark's actual budget. He dove headfirst into the 30 Years' War mostly on vibes alone. His army got demolished at Lutter in 1626, Imperial forces overran Jutland, and Denmark crawled into a humiliating peace. Did Christian learn his lesson? Absolutely not. He immediately started a brand new war, this time against Sweden, and lost that one even more thoroughly. His son inherited a kingdom drowning in debt, with mortgaged crown lands and a shattered economy. Denmark's great power status quietly packed its bags forever. 29. Italy in 1494 had no idea what was barreling toward it when Charles VIII of France crossed the Alps with a giant army to claim a crown his great-grandmother had once sort of mentioned in passing. The campaign succeeded briefly, cost staggering sums in mercenary wages, then collapsed spectacularly when every Italian prince formed a coalition and chased him straight back home. He returned dragging a few looted paintings, no Naples, and absolutely no money. Worse, he had ignited the Italian Wars, a 65-year financial nightmare that bankrupted French kings one after another in succession. His afternoon stroll into Italy quietly devoured French treasuries for decades. 30. Brighton Pavilion was originally meant to be a modest little seaside retreat. George IV turned it into a fevered hallucination of Indian domes, Chinese dragons, and chandeliers heavy enough to flatten a horse. As Prince Regent and later king, he piled up debt so monstrous that Parliament had to bail him out repeatedly, while he kept right on ordering fresh wallpaper and exotic furniture. His coronation in 1821 alone cost £240,000, roughly 20 times that of his father's. He owned hundreds of waistcoats and reportedly spent so freely on a single banquet that the chef quit in despair. The British treasury looked positively exhausted by his death. 31. Brazilian gold poured into Lisbon by the shipload under John V of Portugal, and somehow he still managed to spend faster than the boats could arrive. Obsessed with outshining Versailles, he built the colossal palace convent of Mafra, a project so vast it employed 52,000 workers and crammed a basilica, library, and royal apartments under a single absurd roof. He commissioned silver thrones, diamond-studded carriages, and an embassy to the Pope so theatrically expensive that contemporaries described it as a moving city of gold. By his death in 1750, Portugal's coffers were so drained that his successor inherited a treasury wheezing under heavy debts despite owning the richest gold colony on Earth. A gold rush spent almost entirely on wallpaper. 32. Refusing to attend court for nearly 3 decades was somehow only the second strangest thing the Wanli Emperor of Ming China did to his treasury. Locked away in the Forbidden City, surrounded by enormous personal art collections, he poured staggering sums into building his own colossal underground tomb, the Dingling, decades before he actually needed it. He then financed 3 back-to-back wars, including a brutal struggle to drive Japanese armies out of Korea, draining the imperial silver reserves to historic lows. Provincial governors stopped receiving instructions because the bureaucracy collapsed. By his death in 1620, the Ming dynasty was gasping for air, and within a generation it would simply cease to exist. 33. Fathering reportedly over 100 children with various wives and concubines was an expensive hobby, and Murad III of the Ottoman Empire absolutely committed to it. Maintaining this enormous private household consumed staggering portions of the imperial treasury, To make matters significantly worse, he debased the silver akshay coinage in 1585, slashing its silver content nearly in half and triggering ferocious inflation across the empire. The Janissaries, paid in increasingly worthless coins, mutinied and stormed the palace. Provincial governors began ignoring orders from a Constantinople that couldn't even pay its own soldiers. Murad died in 1595, leaving an Ottoman economy quietly groaning under the weight of his enormous personal life. 34. Building an enormous new palace right next to an existing royal palace was apparently essential, according to Sultan Abdul Aziz, ruling an Ottoman empire already wobbling under centuries of decline. He raised the Turayan Palace in marble and gold leaf, hosted parties that consumed entire provinces' annual tax revenue, and imported a brand new ironclad navy purely because European monarchs had ironclad navies. To pay for the parade, the Ottomans took staggering loans at brutal interest. By 1875, they defaulted on roughly £200 million. European powers calmly walked in and set up the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, basically running Ottoman finances like a foreign repo crew. 35. Chasing an imaginary crown for nearly 20 years became Alfonso X of Castile's bizarre full-time hobby. Called the wise for his patronage of poetry and astronomy, he was absolutely not wise about money. He spent enormous fortunes pursuing the Holy Roman Imperial title, sending bribes and ambassadors across Europe to lobby for an election he ultimately lost. He minted debased coinage to fund the failed campaign, devastating Castilian commerce. His own son Sancho rebelled against him because the kingdom had been bled dry. Alfonso died in 1284 disinherited by his own family, financially humiliated, having achieved beautiful astronomical tables and absolutely nothing imperial. The stars he charted at least were free. 36. Henry IV of Castile earned the unflattering nickname Henry the Impotent, but his treasury management deserved an equally unflattering nickname. He debased the Castilian currency repeatedly, minting so many low-quality coins that prices doubled within a few years and merchants began refusing royal money outright. He gave away crown lands to favorites with shocking enthusiasm, including roughly half of all royal estates, leaving future monarchs with almost nothing left to tax. His half-sister Isabella eventually inherited the wreckage in 1474, and she had to spend years clawing back lost lands. Henry essentially gift-wrapped a financial disaster and tied a tasteful ribbon around it for the next generation. 37. Royal expenses tripled within only a few years under James I, and the man had a special talent for turning gold into thin air. He invented a brand new aristocratic title called baronet, specifically so he could sell it for cash, openly auctioned peerages like merchandise at a market stall, and gifted his favorite courtiers diamonds worth small counties. Inheriting Elizabeth's healthy treasury, he spent like someone who had only just discovered the concept of money. By 1621, the crown owed roughly £900,000, an apocalyptic sum at the time. He handed his son Charles the bill, gave a polite wave, and exited stage left into history's hall of fiscal disasters. 38. Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia preferred drinking wine over governing, which is an understandable preference until your kingdom starts evaporating around your ankles. He pawned imperial regalia, sold offices to the highest bidders, and let German nobles essentially run his finances into a ditch while he took long, pleasant naps. His brother Sigismund and various electors deposed him as Holy Roman Emperor in 1400 specifically because the imperial treasury had become a sad echoing chamber. He kept Bohemia, kept drinking, and kept losing money on bizarre projects until the Hussite revolts erupted partly because of his catastrophic mismanagement. Few kings achieved so much fiscal damage while accomplishing so little. 39. Getting captured by your enemies on the battlefield is bad enough, but John II of France managed to turn it into a kingdom-wide financial catastrophe. After being seized by the English at Poitiers in 1356, his ransom was set at 3 million gold crowns, an astronomical figure that France had absolutely no realistic way to pay. To raise it, the country was squeezed dry through new taxes, debased coinage, and forced loans, sparking peasant revolts and urban uprisings across the realm. When his hostage son escaped England, John honorably returned to captivity in London, conveniently dying there in 1364. France was left financially gutted, paying ransom installments for decades after the king himself was already in his tomb. 40. Bribing Roman senators on an industrial scale became Ptolemy XII's signature foreign policy, and Egypt's treasury never quite recovered from the receipts. Nicknamed Auletes, meaning the flute player because he loved playing flute more than ruling, he handed Julius Caesar and Pompey roughly 6,000 talents of gold simply to recognize him as legitimate king. When that gold ran out, he borrowed wildly from a Roman financier called Rabirius at brutal interest. The Egyptian people, watching their grain reserves shipped off to pay Roman creditors, eventually rioted and chased him out. He returned by bribing his way back in. He left his daughter Cleopatra a kingdom drowning in Roman debt. 41. Paying off Viking raiders to politely go away became Ethelred the Unready's entire foreign policy, and the bill turned into one of the largest royal protection rackets in medieval history. Between 991 and 1012, English silver was handed over again and again, with payments climbing from £10,000 all the way up to a staggering £48,000, some so enormous that archaeologists still find Ethelred's coins scattered across Scandinavia today. The Vikings cheerfully took the silver, then came back next year for more. England was bled white. By 1013, the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard simply walked in and seized the throne, which Ethelred had practically gift-wrapped through decades of expensive cowardice. 42. Personal grudges turned out to be a hilariously bad reason to start a major European war, and Frederick IV of Denmark proved it by dragging his kingdom into the Great Northern War. He maintained a famously expensive court, built the Frederiksberg Palace, and kept multiple official mistresses simultaneously, creating endless awkward succession disputes that themselves cost money to untangle. His fiscal solution to chronic shortfalls was a brilliant idea called the extra tax, then another extra tax, then another. By the war's end in 1721, Denmark had survived but emerged exhausted, with Norway's economy hollowed and royal finances in genuinely desperate shape. The mistresses, naturally, kept their pensions throughout. 43. Painting delicate birds and collecting strange-shaped rocks turned out to be ruinously expensive hobbies for Emperor Huizong of Song China. He built the Genyue, an enormous artificial mountain garden hauled stone by stone from across his empire using a forced transport system that nearly broke local economies. He commissioned painting academies, jade collections, and porcelain workshops while quietly ignoring his military almost entirely. When the Jurchen armies invaded in 1126, the imperial treasury was so depleted it couldn't even raise an effective defense. Huizong was captured and spent his final years as a prisoner in the freezing north, while the Song dynasty lost its entire northern half forever to a budget priority list that put pebbles before soldiers. 44. Watching your country get partitioned 3 times while you stubbornly fund cultural reforms is a uniquely tragic legacy, and Stanisław August Poniatowski lived it as Poland's final king. The fiscal damage didn't begin with him, but his attempts to modernize the country on borrowed money certainly didn't help. He poured fortunes into rebuilding Warsaw, founding schools, and patronizing artists, valiant projects in a kingdom that desperately needed an army first. He borrowed personally from Russian Empress Catherine II, his former lover, which was every bit as humiliating as it sounds. By the final partition in 1795, Poland ceased to exist as a state, and Stanisław abdicated under Russian pressure, dying in St. Petersburg buried in personal debts. 44 kingdoms wrecked, 44 fortunes vaporized. Tell me this in the comments, and don't dodge it. Which one of these spectacular failures actually deserves their reputation, and which one is unfairly judged because history simply found a convenient scapegoat? Pick the most overrated disaster on this list and the most underrated one. The comment section needs that fight. Hit like if you enjoyed the chaos, subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive, and let's keep digging through the weird parts of history together.